Canadians want action on climate change, and Canadians also want to see us continuing to grow the economy. The team that we've assembled here is a team that is going to focus on working hard every single day for Canadians.
The table is set for a new parliament. Today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revealed who will make up his inner circle, those who will help him govern a minority when MPs return next month. In his cabinet are new faces and old, and some notable changes. Chrystia Freeland is leaving her Foreign Affairs file. Today, she was named Deputy Prime Minister as well as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. She'll try to address post-election anger and alienation in Saskatchewan and Alberta. François-Philippe Champagne has been promoted to Freeland's old job. He was formerly Minister of Infrastructure. One of Champagne's top priorities will be resolving that ongoing dispute with China. Catherine McKenna becomes Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. She spent the last 4 years at the helm of environment and climate change. Filling her shoes there is Jonathan Wilkinson. He was previously in charge of fisheries and oceans. Following Ralph Goodale's loss in the election, Bill Blair will take over as Minister of Public Safety, a big file that oversees the RCMP as well as security intelligence. And there's Marco Mendocino. He's one of the new members of Cabinet. He's been named Immigration Minister. Another one, Mark Miller, a Quebec MP, will take over the file of Indigenous Services. And there are a couple of parliamentary rookies in Cabinet, including Stephen Guilbeault, a well-known Quebec environmentalist. He'll take on the role of Heritage Minister. We want to bring in one of the Cabinet ministers now. Jonathan Wilkinson, as we mentioned, is the new Minister of Environment and Climate Change. He joins me from just outside Rideau Hall. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time, and congratulations on your new portfolio.
Thank you very much.
I want to start off by asking you a question that I noticed the Prime Minister got from a number of members of the Quebec media, and that is, why isn't Stephen Guilbeault, who we know is a prominent Quebec environmentalist, in your job? Is your appointment to the portfolio an acknowledgement that that would have been taken rather as an affront by the West?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, we all come to these positions with different experiences and skills. It's certainly not always the case that you're appointed to a position that is something that you've done for many years. Certainly, Mr. Guilbeault will be a person that I will call on for advice and to discuss issues relating to climate change and a range of other environmental issues. But I think the Prime Minister looked at where he felt people could make the most significant contribution. I'm certainly honored to be asked to lead the fight on climate change and to address a range of environmental issues. It's certainly something that I have some experience in, having worked with Catherine McKenna as the Parliamentary Secretary for the first 2 years of this government.
Is there, though, something to the idea of your appointment being a little bit, at least, about the sentiment that's being expressed out west? We had you on the show a few weeks ago. I remember you mentioning quite often that you spend a lot of time in Saskatchewan, that you work there as well. I mean, you do have a history in the province. You obviously represent a riding in BC. Is there sort of something implicit within your appointment that you will be dealing with some very stark feelings in Saskatchewan and Alberta?
Well, I think certainly there are opportunities to build on some of the experiences I've had. Some of those relate to having grown up in Saskatchewan, and I think as we talked about the last time, I worked for a Premier of Saskatchewan. I did federal-provincial relations on the provincial side for the province of Saskatchewan. But I think also, I mean, I spent the 15 years before getting into politics as a CEO and a senior executive in clean technology, working on industrial technologies, many of which related to how do you reduce carbon emissions. And so I think that technology background is actually something that can be useful in thinking about different pathways that we may be able to use to move down this energy transition in a way that can respond to the legitimate concerns and aspirations of all regions of this country, certainly including Alberta and Saskatchewan. Let
me ask you more specifically about your portfolio. Your party, of course, ran on a goal of reaching net zero emissions to be carbon neutral by 2050. When exactly will you announce the plan and the details of the plan to get to that goal?
So the plan is going to be the product of additional consultation and work that we are going to do over the coming months. It is something that is not a political or a partisan statement. Net zero by 2050 is what the scientists tell us we must do if we are to avert the kinds of rise in temperature that would be very, very challenging for all of us who live on this planet. So it's a scientific issue. I think that it's incumbent on all of us to put partisanship aside on an issue that is so fundamentally important, to dial down the rhetoric and to look at how we can collaborate in a way that can come up with a plan that will allow us to meet our targets, but do so in a way that is sensitive to all parts of the country. I certainly will be reaching out to other parties in Parliament. I will certainly be reaching out to folks across the country to ensure that we're getting their views and perspectives as we look to put together a plan that will be effective.
Why should Canadians believe that your government will be able to attain the targets that you set if they are more aggressive? The current targets that you've set back in January, the Department of the Environment projected that even under a best case scenario in which all of what you've promised is implemented, emissions in 2030 will only be 19% below 2005 levels. Of course, the stated goal at this point of your government was to bring them 30% below those 2005 levels. The NDP has asked for some kind of accountability mechanism, legislated perhaps. Is that something you're considering?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are very focused on achieving and potentially exceeding the 2030 numbers. We have brought forward the net zero by 2050 because that is what science tells us we must do. We need to put together a thoughtful plan, one that certainly will build on some of the areas around technology that I think are very important in the context of this conversation. And we have committed to building in some types of accountability mechanisms. I think that's important. And in those conversations, I'm certainly more than willing and will be reaching out to have those conversations with other parties.
Will they be legislated?
Well, that's the conversation that we will be having with others, including other parties, but with stakeholders around the country. But at the end of the day, we need to have an effective plan. We all know, and Canadians were very clear in terms of the way that they voted, that we must address climate change, and it must be done in a substantive way. We must have pathways through which we are going to achieve the targets that we establish.
Circling back to an issue that we spoke about at the beginning of this interview, and that is the feelings in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Two pieces of legislation continually get brought up by the political representatives of those provinces, C-48 and C-69. Are there any circumstances under which your government would consider amending those pieces of legislation?
Well, I'm 3 hours into the job. I am certainly open to conversations with stakeholders and with provinces with respect to their thoughts and concerns. Certainly, I think there may be opportunities for us to look at implementation and how 69 gets implemented in a way that looks to try to meet some of those concerns. But, we're 3 hours in. Let's have those conversations and see where we go from there.
Do you think those pieces of legislation fell short?
Well, I don't actually. I mean, I was working with Minister McKenna when we were developing C-69. I think C-69 really is intended to try to front load a lot of the process to ensure that we're flagging issues at the front end such that good projects can go ahead. It is a significant improvement on the environmental assessment process that was put into place in 2012 when Prime Minister Harper gutted the existing environmental assessment process. But it is fundamentally aimed at ensuring that we are addressing issues like the environmental issues and Indigenous issues early in the process so that good projects can, in fact, move ahead. And I think that's what it does. That being said, I am certainly not closed to conversations about how can this be implemented in a way that addresses concerns that may exist in some parts of the country or in particular sectors.
I take your point on the intent of the bill, but I'm sure you've heard Jason Kenney call it a no more pipelines bill. You've heard that echoed from business leaders as well. Are they wrong?
Well, I would say let's have a conversation. I think we all need to dial down the rhetoric a little bit here and try to actually engage in substantive discussion. As you will know, 69 went through an enormous number of consultations, and it was amended very significantly in the Senate to try to address some of the concerns that have been raised. I am not closed to the idea of working on implementation and finding ways to ensure that we are addressing some of the concerns that Premier Kenney or others have raised. But let's dial down the rhetoric and let's actually have a conversation.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you for this conversation. I appreciate your time, Minister Wilkinson.
Thank you very much.
Environment and Climate Change Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. For more on today's cabinet changes, I'm joined by the CBC's Chris Hall, host of CBC Radio's The House. Hi, Chris.
Hello there.
All right, so a couple of things to digest here. Obviously, one of them is the signal that the Prime Minister is trying to send with the makeup of this cabinet. We just had one minister there where there is some signal being sent, the fact that he talks about his time in Saskatchewan, things like that. What kind of big message did you get from this cabinet today?
Two of them. The first is that the Prime Minister is now trying to give meaning to what he said after the election campaign, that he understands the frustration of the Prairie Province, Saskatchewan and Alberta, where not a single Liberal was elected. So Jonathan Wilkinson, some connection to Saskatchewan. They're playing big that Chrystia Freeland came from Alberta and has family there still. But the broader message, I think, for people who are watching tonight is continuity. If change was the big deal in 2015, it's now stability and continuity. We heard a lot of that from Jonathan Wilkinson tonight. C-69, well, I think it's actually a pretty good bill. I'm willing to listen, but not necessarily to change. So I think that's the message they're trying to send. Not only did only 2 cabinet ministers not returned to cabinet, 3 if you count Jim Carr, who is getting treated for cancer and will be a special representative to the Prime Minister on the prairies. But only 2 didn't come back. So a lot of familiar faces, and many of those people in key positions remain in those. Bill Morneau in finance, Navdeep Bains, obviously in innovation, Harjit Sajjan in defense. So Canadians should take from this that this government doesn't see that it needs to make a lot of wholesale changes at the cabinet level in order to address the issues that were raised during the campaign.
One big change, though, is Chrystia Freeland. She obviously remains in cabinet, but she moves from an outward-looking portfolio, that of foreign affairs, to one that is distinctly inward-looking as Deputy Premier as well as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. What do you make of that, Shep?
Yeah, look, she had considerable diplomatic skills to be able to deal with Donald Trump and his negotiators on NAFTA. Deputy Prime Minister carries some symbolism to it. There hasn't been one since Anne McClellan, but it does show that she is now clearly the second in command here, and if she has future leadership aspirations herself, it's not a bad place to be. On the same token, she does have considerable responsibility. She will need to deliver on some of the things that the government promised during the last election campaign. How are they going to resolve concerns over climate change and the agenda to meet the targets that were set? How are they going to pacify or placate Scott Moe and Jason Kenney over the price on carbon, the federal backstop? How are they going to move forward on things where there might even be some common ground, like pharmacare, for example? Is that going to be a priority? And if so, how do they do that with the provinces? So she has considerable responsibility, but I believe also considerable latitude, from what I've heard from the people I've talked to today, to try and make those negotiations, to try and promote national unity, to prevent those regional differences, which frankly are as bad as they were in the early 1990s when reform first emerged and the Bloc Québécois was around. These are the same kinds of tensions the country faces, and they need somebody who's able to bring the whole of government into addressing and trying to ameliorate those things. And
we'll get Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe's take a little bit later in the show. We'll also get more of your take a bit later with the Power panel coming up. Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate your insights. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.